Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's message. I'm Eric, the lead pastor of South Mountain Community Church. Thank you for taking just a bit of your time to be with us today. We exist for one reason, and that's to help as many people as possible take their next step towards becoming fully devoted and fully delighted followers of Jesus Christ. And I know that for so many people, church and even religion can be messy and oh so complicated, but it doesn't have to be that way. Here you can belong before you believe. So our hope is that your first visit with us is enjoyable, meaningful, and unlike the church experiences of your past. We also think that the best way to experience delight is with others in person. So SMCC is about more than just a Sunday sermon. We have 5 locations for you to choose from where you can connect with people in authentic community. We want every message you hear to engage your head, your heart, and your hands for a life of full delight. So with all of that in mind, enjoy today's message.
All right. Well, for those of you I haven't met, my name's Trevor. I serve as one of the pastors here at SMCC. Just want to say, if you're new with us, thank you for trusting us with a portion of your Mother's Day morning. And if you have been here for years, thank you for trusting us with a portion of your Mother's Day morning. And happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. So this morning, what I'd like to do is speak from the subject of 1-star reviews. So I'd like to start with this idea that bad ratings and reviews can actually be good, that they can be helpful, they can be a very good thing. So there's a restaurant that used to be around here called Crack Shack that did something that I thought was brilliant and hilarious. So actually in their bathrooms, if you were ever there, in their bathrooms, their wallpaper was made up of 1-star reviews that they had received as a restaurant, which with a name like Crack Shack, you can imagine some of those reviews were just fantastic. It was great. And unfortunately, it's closed down now, been replaced by Houston Hot Chicken, which is also good. But in the spirit of our departed fried chicken spot, I thought we could open up this morning with a few of our own 1-star reviews. So these are a few that we actually have received as a church. So here's one of them. It says this: not impressed that they do not have a men's ministry. We do have a men's ministry. In addition to that, it says, and what bugs me the most is that I want to get to know God and the Bible on a deeper level. I appreciate that desire, but they want you to pay money for them to teach you about God. This is why I hate churches. All about money. Really turned me off to this place. So I believe at the time, this is in reference to a class, 8-week class. The registration was $10. I don't know if that warrants a 1-star review. You tell me. But here's another one. It says the music was nice. Then it goes downhill from there. It says, I may have visited on a wrong day. There was a guest speaker. Hold on to that note just for a minute. And I really didn't agree with what he was saying. I've been a Christian over 42 years, born again, spirit-filled, praying tongues, walking with my Jesus. The bottom line, preach the word. Apparently that didn't happen that day. It says, the Bible says that once you are born again, you are a new creature. Dead to the sin nature and the Spirit of God dwells with you. New creature. I actually agree with most of what has been said in there, with what she says there. But then she takes it to kind of a different level and says, this man talking repeatedly kept telling us we had Jonah in us. Jonah was a lesson in the Bible. Nowhere does it say we have Jonah in us. Before we are born again, we have the sin nature because of Adam, but once you're born again, you are a new creature in Christ and the old man is dead. I do not have Jonah in me. I am a temple of the Holy Ghost. That's the review. Okay, so this one is actually in direct reference to me. I earned us a 1-star review in my first month here. I was the guest speaker. I was just new. And thankfully, they kept me around. I'm glad to still be here. But in my defense, I'll just say this. The ironic part is that Jonah didn't think he had any issues either. That's all I'll say. Okay, third and final one. This says this: bad church, ... they lie. Evil suspicion is not true spiritual discernment. I'm not even sure what that means. Evil is there. They will even kick your tire. Okay, if anyone has kicked your tire, I'm sorry. And if anyone is kicking tires, please stop doing that. It says bad church. Black doesn't mean you are not right. White doesn't mean you are right. We all need God's light to fight hell's fight. I like the rhyming scheme. I'm not even sure overall what it's getting at, but there's clearly passion there. So those are a few of our 1-star reviews. Thankfully, we have others as well. You can check them out sometime. But I'll say this. Reviews are helpful because they provide a track record. They give us a sense of what other people have experienced at a particular place or with a person so that we can know what to expect. Because when you begin to see consistency among the reviews and the ratings, that gives you a sense that there's a consistent track record here. That if other people on a consistent basis have experienced this, then chances are I will experience the very same thing here as well. And that is why track record plays such a significant role when it comes to making good trust decisions. So today we're actually continuing and even bringing to a close our series around trust called Trust Issues, where we've been trying to break down what trust is and its multiple different components. And one of the things we've said is that trust is like the oxygen of real life relationally. It's what gives us the ability to be at ease in relationships, to be at peace, to be relaxed, to be vulnerable with other people, and to feel safe as we do so. And for that reason, if we have the inability to trust, it's almost like we can't breathe relationally. It's like we're always tense and stressed and anxious and worried about what other people are thinking, what their motives are, what their actions are ultimately aimed at. We don't trust anyone, and it's an incredibly stressful way to live our lives. And yet most of the time, if we're there, what got us there is that we chose to trust a person or an organization or a church only to get burned in the end. And so we're not so willing to put ourselves out there again. And that's why we've really been breaking down trust in its multiple different components so that we can understand it better, to know when it's safe and when it's not safe to trust in our relationships. And I hope that at this point in the series, what's become clear is that while trust is always a risk, it doesn't need to be a gamble. It doesn't need to feel like rolling the dice in a relationship and hoping that things pop up well and we don't get burned. There's a far better, far more helpful way to approach trust. And that's what we've been trying to unpack over the course of these 5 weeks together. And so with that, just a little bit of a recap coming from Henry Cloud's book called Trust, where a lot of this content comes from. He breaks trust down into these 5 different components: understanding, intent or motivation, ability to come through in a particular way, and then character, the capacity to kind of meet the demands of reality in difficult circumstances. So track record is the 5th and final one, and track record is basically adding the element of time to all of the 4 that came before it. So what is the person's track record, or the place's track record, according to these other 4 over the course of time? And if I could kind of simplify and condense today's message, today's topic of track record, down to its simplest terms, and I think the clearest and most direct way to put it would be this: when considering track record in light of trust, don't trust someone who has a terrible track record. Don't do it. It's a bad idea. It will only get you burned. As Henry Cloud says, the best predictor of the future is the past. People and places tend to be consistent. What they have offered in the past is likely what they will offer in the future. And so if what they have offered in the past is bad or negative or terrible, then pay attention to that when it comes time to make a trust decision with them. And the biblical writings actually speak to this as well. Proverbs 27:12 says this, that the prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. Now, prudence isn't really a word that we throw around favorably today in our own kind of day and age, and yet in the biblical writings, specifically in the book of Proverbs, prudence actually is a very good thing. It's someone who weighs their actions and considers their words before they do or say something, and their life tends to go better because of it. And so this is saying, in the context of relationships, a prudent person recognizes danger. They recognize when someone has a terrible track record, and they factor that into their trust decision, perhaps scaling back trust, perhaps scaling back vulnerability with this person or this place in order to avoid the harm that would come otherwise. And this is actually a very wise thing to do. For example, if someone has a track record of having affairs, just to spell this out in kind of a few different specific contexts, if someone has that track record of having affairs, then that's a significant thing to weigh into whether or not you have a romantic relationship with this person. If someone has a track record of making horrible financial decisions on a regular basis, then that weighs into how or where or with what you choose to trust that person with, or at least it should, right? If someone avoids conflict like the plague, then that should weigh into where and with what and to what degree we trust that person. That track records play a significant role in whether or not we trust people, or at least they should. Because I think the truth is, intellectually, a lot of what we're saying about track records is kind of self-evident. It's easy to understand. If someone has a terrible track record, don't trust them. On this side of the equation, it's very easy to understand. And yet so often, in the arena of actual lived experience, we make that decision all the time. We make the decision to trust people with terrible track records over and over and over again. And I think the question is, why? Why do we continue to subject ourselves to harm? Why do we continue to allow ourselves to be burned? Why do we continue to trust people and places that have burned us time and time again? I think the truth is there's probably a variety of different answers to that question, but the one that rises to the top for me would be this, that the majority of the time I think it's because we're fooled by the sincerity of their sorry. That on the other side of whatever went south, right, there's a conversation in which they say, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen. This will never happen again. I swear that it's over. I'll change. I'll be different. You can trust me. And what's often underlying in that conversation is our desire to actually trust that person, that we want it to be true. And so we make the decision based on the sincerity and the emotion of their appeal to choose to trust them again. And yet time and time again, what happens is we just get burned because the track record stays the same. And I think a far more helpful way to approach it is not to say that an apology or a sorry doesn't matter at all, but I think it's just to put it into its proper context in light of track record. And I think you could look at it like this, that sorry doesn't earn trust, but it can open the door to repairing it. Just to take this into the context of one of the examples we gave earlier, let's say that there's a marriage in which an affair occurs. And on the other side of it, the couple, they choose to work through it and try and repair the relationship. And I think in addition to an apology, let's say that opens the door to rebuilding trust. I think in order for trust to actually be rebuilt and repaired, it's a series of incremental deposits that are made over the course of time to rebuild what was broken, to repair what was lost. And so, for example, every time that, the spouse who had the affair, every time they make the change, instead of hiding things, instead of keeping things kind of secret and hidden, they make the decision to live with absolute and utter transparency, giving complete access to all of their devices, their communication, even their location to their spouse at all times. That begins to put back trust. Let's say in addition to that, they begin to form a network of supportive relationships to kind of get to the root of what was ever underneath kind of that behavior within their life. And they form this group that they meet with for support. They meet with them on a regular basis. Every time they do that and they reach out for help and they show up to the group meeting, that's putting in another little incremental deposit of trust. And every time they begin to prioritize the marriage and that relationship rather than their work, rather than their hobbies, rather than their friends, every time they prioritize this, every time they make a decision to do that, that begins to put in a little bit more trust. Over the course of time, what was lost, what was burned, what was broken can begin to be repaired and remade. And so sorry, it doesn't repair what was broken, but it can open the door to trust being rebuilt incrementally over time. Now, up until this point, we've kind of looked at trust from one particular angle, which is probably the more favorable one to look at, where we're looking at people who have burned us, right? But the truth is, I think we've left half of the conversation undone if we don't also flip it around and consider things from the other angle, because there are always times in relationships, in places, contexts within our lives in which we are not the ones who have been burned, but we are the ones who have done the burning. Right? There's always a point in time in which we're the one who has actually impacted the trust negatively, that we've hurt someone that we have loved or cared about. And I think even beyond that, the question I want to speak to is maybe you found yourself in a place where you have asked the question, why do I continue to do this? I've been the one who's made that appeal with emotion and sincerity that it's done, it's over, I'll never do this again, and yet I've just continued to make the same mistake. I've continued to harm the people I love in the same way over and over again, and I don't understand this about myself. Why do I continue to do this? I don't want to do this. And I think sometimes if we've been there, the question we can end up wrestling with is there actually any hope for me to change? Is there any chance that my track record might be something other than what it has always been? Is there any hope that I could be worthy of trust again? That's the question that I want to speak to this morning. And I'd like to start by actually looking at a story. It's a story of a man named Zacchaeus, which is just a fun name, but one of the things to understand about Zacchaeus is that he is someone who had burned a significant amount of trust. Because in the first century, the people of Israel, they were ruled over by the Roman Empire. And the Romans, the Roman soldiers would bully the people of Israel because they had complete authority and power to do so without consequence. They would tax them relentlessly, pushing them into poverty, causing them to face severe consequences if they didn't pay up in their taxes. And so because of all of this, the people of Israel, they hated the Romans more than just about anyone else. But the one person they hated more than the Romans was when someone from their own people would actually sign up with the Romans and become basically on the side of the oppressors. And this is exactly what Zacchaeus had done. Even though he was Jewish, he had signed on to become a Jewish tax collector working for the Roman government, being the one who actually enforces these taxes upon his own people, pushing his own family, members of his own community into poverty, into a life of struggle and difficulty, tattling on the Roman Empire on them when they didn't, forcing them to face horrific consequences. And so because of these decisions, Zacchaeus, he was wealthy, he had means, and yet he lacked any relationships whatsoever. He is someone who was hated by all and trusted by none until he meets Jesus. This is what we see. Luke chapter 19, verse 1. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. And so people are lined up waiting for Jesus to come through. He's short, he can't see over. Chances are at the same time, he's got clothing that displays his wealth. And so everyone knows who he is. They know how he attained his wealth. And so nobody is interested in giving him any favors. No one's going to part in the crowd to give him a spot to be able to see Jesus. He knows that nobody likes him, that everyone hates him. And so he does this to be able to see Jesus. Verse 4, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Verse 5, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up into the tree where Zacchaeus is hanging out and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Now, in 21st century context, I think we hear this and we're like, man, he just invited himself over. If someone did that to me, I'd be like, oh, I've got to do my laundry, fold my laundry, put my laundry away, and make some banana bread. I'm not ready for you. Come over Wednesday. And yet, in a first century context, what's important to know is that Jesus is a rabbi at this point who's very popular, who is very influential and important within society. So he's someone who carries a significant amount of honor. And when he says, I'm coming to your place, he is bestowing an immense amount of honor upon Zacchaeus. And he's doing it in front of everyone, in front of all of these people who hate Zacchaeus. And you can see this both from the way Zacchaeus responds and even from the way that everyone else responds, right? Verse 6, it says that he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. He is overjoyed because he's not used to being treated this way. He's not used to receiving such kindness, such favor, such grace. And yet Jesus extends this to him, and the response of everyone else in the vicinity is to be upset. Verse 7, all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner, of this traitorous, backstabbing tax collector. He's gone to his house. We hate this guy. And then Zacchaeus does something astounding. Verse 8, it says, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, to Jesus, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. He's saying that on the spot, I'm giving away half of my wealth to the poor, which is a significant amount of money, being a chief tax collector. And yet, he also says that anyone I've wronged, which he likely had done, right, skimming a little bit off the top to line his own pockets, he's saying, I'll pay them back not only what I took from them, but 4 times that amount, just to make right what I had made wrong in the past. And Jesus' response to him is to say that today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man, in reference to himself, came to seek and to save the lost. In other words, prior to this, Zacchaeus was lost, and yet here, in a relationship and trusting in Jesus, he's found. And I think there's a couple of things to take away from this that are important. First off, it's easy to misread the story. I think it's easy to misread it and to think that Zacchaeus, he does this. He makes the wrongs right, and that's what makes him right with Jesus. That if he didn't fix these things, then Jesus wouldn't be pleased with him. Jesus wouldn't love him. And yet, that's actually getting the order of the story wrong. It's not that Zacchaeus makes things right and then Jesus comes by while he's in the tree and says, hey, I love what you did. I'm coming to your house. It's while Zacchaeus is still hated by everyone, has still wronged his own people, his own family, his own community, while no one trusts him, while he is someone that is despised by the entire community. It's while he's in that position that Jesus says to him, I'm coming to your house. It's while he's there that Jesus bestows upon him something he has likely never received before in his life, which is grace, a kindness that he has not earned, a favor that he does not deserve. And it's in response to that grace that Zacchaeus is changed. And you can see the change flow out from him as he chooses willingly to make right what he has made wrong in the past. And then some. I think what we can take away from the story is that Jesus changed his track record, because it was through the bestowal of grace that Jesus actually changed him from the inside out. And the result of that was that his own track record changed. That's why we even think of Zacchaeus in entirely different terms than what he was known prior to this event, because Jesus changed his track record. And this is far from the only place that we see that. For example, we've been looking at the story of the woman at the well several times throughout this series from John chapter 4. And basically, she was a woman who had been cast out, rejected, condemned by her entire community. And she's someone who was alienated, who had no friends, who had no support. And basically, from man to man to man, she would seek out whoever she could to find protection and provision, and she would get bounced from one to the next. She was a person who had endured horrific suffering in this way. And yet, on the other side of Jesus, right, he takes her and he forms a relationship with her. She begins to trust him, and she is changed, transformed from the inside out, to where for the first time in her life, she recognizes her God-given self-worth, that she is a person who is worthy of love, who is worthy of respect. And on the other side of their exchange, she actually makes her way back into the very community that had rejected her, going with joy to share with them what Jesus had done in her life. He changed her track record. And again, we see this not just in those couple of stories, but we see it again and again and again. For example, Peter, one of the disciples, he, prior to Jesus, was an arrogant, egotistical fisherman who was going nowhere. And yet Jesus took him and transformed him into one of the most influential leaders history has ever known. John, another one of the disciples, was entitled and argumentative and selfish, and yet Jesus took him and transformed him into one of the most selfless and loving people who has ever walked the earth. Mary Magdalene was a prostitute prior to Jesus, and yet he took her and transformed her into someone who has come to be known as the first person to ever interact with the risen Jesus and the other side of his resurrection. Right, the first person to witness the most significant and pivotal moment in all of human history. And even Paul, who wrote half the New Testament, prior to Jesus, he was a legalistic, self-righteous, cold-blooded murderer. And yet Jesus took him and transformed him through trust and turned him into an instrument that would bring life, the life that Jesus provides, to thousands upon thousands all throughout the Roman Empire. Every single one of them had a track record prior to Jesus, and not one of them was good. And yet on the other side of a relationship with him, they were changed. And over time, that changed their track record. If there's one thing to take away from this, it's that Jesus actually has a track record of changing our track records. And that's true not only in the biblical writings, but even in this room, right? There are so many people who have experienced this even in their own lives, myself included. And I know I've shared this before, but if you kind of wind back the clock, right? I know I look put together today on Mother's Day morning, but if you wind back the clock 14 or 15 years, you find a very different version of me, where instead of jeans and a collared shirt, basically you would have found me in blue scrub pants, not because I worked in the medical field, just because I thought they were incredibly comfortable, which they are. and a purple striped sweater that I affectionately refer to as my purple haze sweater, hair down to my shoulders, and I can assure you I was not pulling it off, hanging out in either my dad's basement or my brother's living room, basically with a glazed look across my face and my eyes that stemmed from the marijuana PBR combo. And that's Pabst Blue Ribbon. It actually was the world's best beer in 1894, fun fact. and at this point in my life, I was, in a lot of ways, I was just miserable. Because there are certain questions that I think are core to the human experience. Questions like sense of identity. Who am I? What's my purpose? What sense of belonging? All of these things I did not have answers to. And they were like black holes in my life that ripped and tore at any shred of peace or joy that I might try and cling on to the point where I was just absolutely miserable. I had no sense of who I was or where I was going, no grounded sense of what my value was. I was completely and utterly lost. Some of you can relate. And yet it was in that season that I came to a trusting relationship in Jesus, and that changed everything. And yeah, I still enjoy PBR. It's the world's best beer, right, by some standards. But that's a joke. It's not, but it's still okay. But having those other questions answered in a way that is solid and grounded and secure, and being able to build a life upon them, a life that is built on a trust in Jesus, is something that has changed everything, not just for me, but for so many others. I think the point is to say that if you've ever wondered, can my track record change? Can I become someone who is worthy of trust again? The answer is absolutely yes. And if I was to point to a verse, it'd probably be this one. 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, therefore, if anyone is in Christ, if they have trusted in Jesus, the new creation has come. The old has gone. The new is here. That by trusting in Jesus, we are actually made new, transformed, changed from the inside out. And as we are changed over the course of time, our track record changes also. Not immediately and not perfectly, because again, it takes time for trust to be rebuilt, and it takes time for our transformation to occur. I'm still a work in progress. And yet, transformation with Jesus is absolutely possible if we will only trust in him. And so as we bring this series to a close and kind of land the plane, again, we've been talking about trust in the context of three main relationships where we often have issues with trust. And that's with God, with others, and with church. So just to kind of pepper through these real quick. With God, taking it broadly in the scope of the entire series, I think this is where we can kind of land the plane, that Jesus has shown us his understanding, his intent or motivation, that he's for us, his character, his track record and ability, so that we might find life in trusting him, because ultimately a life built on trust in Jesus is the life that we were made for. Beyond that, when we move into talking about others, I kind of want to narrow it to track record. And I think this is one really helpful idea to hang on to, that with others, unless some change has occurred, you can expect from people what they've given you in the past. People tend to be consistent, good, bad, or somewhere in the middle. And so sincerity is not something that rebuilds trust alone, but incremental deposits over time. An altered track record is what rebuilds trust. And then finally, when it comes to church, I think in a lot of ways it's actually the same, that unless some change has occurred in leadership or culture, you can expect from a church what it's given you in the past. And this is something that we try and recognize here at SMCC, that we know that essentially with every Sunday, we are building a track record, that with every song and with every sermon, right, with every coffee and with every children's ministry room, with every class and with every small group, with every meeting of men's and women's ministry, with every chance that we have to interact with someone who crosses the threshold of our doors, we are building a track record. And I know that it's not perfect. And yet I hope that it's a track record that you can trust. And I believe that we do have a track record of being a place where people can come who have questions, and they can explore those questions. They can express their doubts openly. They can discuss them. They can explore who Jesus is. And I think we have a track record of being a place where people can explore and meet Jesus and begin to trust him and find that they are transformed in a relationship with him. And I hope that that's a track record that you can trust and find joy in being a part of. But when it comes to trust broadly, I think at the end of the day, the bottom line is this, that to grow in your ability to be trusted, grow in your ability to trust God. Maybe your question is, well, how do I do that? I'd say the same answer that's true for me is also true for you, that we grow in trust by taking one next step of trust in Jesus at a time.
Thank you so much for joining us for today's message and trusting us with your time. If you'd like to connect with one of our pastors or staff, you can easily do that by visiting smccutah.org/connect. When you fill out that quick form, they will get back to you within a few days and be able to connect with you. As well, if you'd like to know more about taking a next step at SMCC, you can easily look at what next steps we have by visiting smccutah.org/next steps. And lastly, if you found today's message both hopeful and helpful, I would encourage you to do maybe one of two things. First, you can share this message with someone that would find it helpful. And you can also choose to partner with us financially so that more people can see messages like this. You can find more information on what that looks like by visiting smccutah.org/give. Again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope to see you at one of our locations soon.